We're talking tourism in Politics 2.0 on netnewsledger.com. It's James with Net News Ledger. Joining us by Zoom is Eric Melillo for his usual weekly call, and Tony Baldinelli, who is the special person on tourism for the Conservative Party. And we're going to be talking about the issues that COVID-19 has done to the tourist industry across Canada and, of course, across Western and Northern Ontario. Tony, welcome. Eric, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
This issue of tourism has just been, it's been brutal, for the outfitters. They've got the border closed. They're trying to do their best to survive. They've had a little bit of support from the government here and there. What do our readers and viewers need to know, Tony?
Well, thanks, James, for that opportunity. And with regards to the tourism sector, what I can say, it's the fifth largest sector in all of Canada. I mean, it's 105 billion to our GDP. It's 1 in 10 of every Canadians are employed in the tourism sector. So it's a hugely important industry for all Canadians in Northern Ontario and in my community. I come from the riding of Niagara Falls. My hometown is Niagara Falls.
So
I have 40
tourism happens there.
Yeah, 40,000 people in my region depend and work in the tourism sector. I've got 16,000 hotel rooms alone in Niagara Falls. And Niagara Falls typically generates about $2.4 billion alone in tourism receipts. And so overnight, that's essentially vanished because of COVID. Our largest employer are the two casinos. That's 4,000 people who have been off work since last March. And so, I mean, I live on a border community. I've got 4 international bridge crossings into the United States. So I, as well as Eric, know the importance of our American visitation to our communities.
It's been difficult. I mean, Thunder Bay, we're 40 minutes to Grand Portage, and for a lot of people here in Thunder Bay, going across the border for the day, or even just driving down to the border to pick up shopping they've had at the border store, it's a ritual, and that's been closed. But more importantly, the Americans coming into Canada for the fishing and the hunting and just general tourism and camps has all been shut down.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And again, I'll just relate it. I mean, I'm right on the border. So, I mean, there's just an intimate connection between our communities and that in the United States. To us, we almost see it not so much as an international border as just a river that divides friends. And so, to your point, I mean, it's about families on both sides of the border. I mean, we have people on our side that will go for medical appointments in Buffalo because they've got a specialized cancer facility there. And so, and we have a number of Americans who actually have cottages on the Canadian side, as well as Canadians on the American side. So, I mean, our economies and our communities are interwoven. And in terms of tourism visitation, and it is probably the same with our Northern outfitters particularly. I mean, domestic visitation in the Niagara and Ontario is about 70% of our visitor base, but it's that 30% that comes from U.S. and international, which provide about 50% of the revenue. And in speaking with the Northern outfitting organizations, I mean, their visitation and their visitor base is based almost entirely, 90% and above, on American visits. And so when we close that border because of COVID, it has had a crushing and negative impact on them.
We're seeing that in Kenora specifically. I spent time as a child in Kenora, and Kenora is a community that has a population of what, Eric, about 10,000 during the winter?
Yeah, they advertise 15 now, but I think we're getting closer to 10.
And in the summertime, it's cottage country for Winnipeg. People from Winnipeg treat Kenora. They used to go to Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba, but now Lake of the Woods is their place for camps, and they come in and they shop and they do business. And so even the border provincially being closed is causing some grief in the community. And what's the solution, Tony? You're the tourism critic on the Conservative side. What should the government be doing?
Well, what we've done, and since the beginning of COVID, I mean, we immediately began working with government to ensure that those programs that they did have in place were better suited for the tourism and hospitality sector. For at the beginning, for example, I mean, the government wanted to implement a 10% wage subsidy program, and we obviously knew that wasn't going to be of assistance. I mean, it needed to be in the range of 75% where other nations were doing, and so we worked and advocated and were helpful in getting that change made so that it would actually assist those businesses who immediately needed that. I mean, programs such as the Canadian Emergency Business Assistance, the loan program, which was $40,000 at the beginning. I mean, we heard immediately from small businesses about the criteria and the low thresholds, which was preventing a number of small businesses from gaining access to that $40,000 loan program, which 10,000 portion of it was interest free. And so what we did was we worked with the government to expand the pay threshold so more businesses could apply. And then we found out for those that were sole proprietors or those that had personal checking accounts instead of business accounts, they couldn't apply. And so we worked with government to ensure that those changes were made so more qualified. And then what we've talked about, I mean, we've worked, I mean, and Eric can speak to this. I mean, we've had motions in the House where we've talked about, you know, the government creating a safe and responsible, data-driven reopening plan and to come back with a plan. I mean, and they voted against that, right? I mean, ultimately, the success is going to be on the vaccine side, and that's where the government has failed miserably in obtaining the number of vaccines that were required so that we can get out of this. I mean, you know, the government likes to talk about having the most robust vaccine portfolio in the world, but that's only good enough if we can get those vaccines into the arms of our residents so that we can get that reopening moving forward. And we're having success on first doses, but now we've got to get those second doses. And you'll see, I mean, all the provincial reopening plans that have come forward and have been announced this week is basically tailored all and based all on vaccine rates and as well as hospitalizations. And so, I mean, it's critical that we start getting people vaccinated and we get to a point where we can get them with 2 doses so that we can begin the process of reopening our economies.
One of the areas that through the pandemic we've been covering and we've talked with provincial and federal leaders on has been, you know, and it ties to tourism, is transportation. You know, in Ontario, we have Porter Air, which has been closed almost over a year. How they're going to reopen is going to be difficult. Just the cost of paying for planes that sit on the ground. And now even getting them back up and running. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen Greyhound announce they're finished in Canada. Intercommunity bus service now is a total piecework and, you know, has fallen apart. And I know that bus companies right across the country have been reaching out through the rural caucus of the Liberal Party, but also through everywhere they can, trying to get a plan together so that the federal government steps in and we have a way to get on a bus in Newfoundland and get off another bus in Vancouver and have a seamless network across the country. Do you think that kind of thing is what we're missing?
Well, you know what? It's interesting you mentioned that, James, because in fact, I just spoke with an operator from Vancouver with regards to intercity bus support from the Wilson company, and they had been spoken, and they're coming forward with proposals with other companies, to your point, across the country on how that they can ensure that Canadians continue to be served in these smaller communities. Which is vitally important.
And I know when I spoke with the Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, on this, she said that the charter buses are just so key for tourism. Oh, and if they all disappear, that's sort of like knocking the building blocks off the bottom of the house. And now how are you going to build a roof?
Yeah, no, she's been a huge advocate for it, and in fact, this one gentleman that I was speaking to earlier this afternoon had mentioned that as well. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and it's difficult in communities down like in our area. They're competing against publicly owned transport, like Go Transit, right? For example, and their bus routes and their bus systems, and how can they compete when, Go is providing service into Niagara Falls, and now you've got these charter services that are trying to do the same thing within communities. So it's difficult for them to compete against that.
Well, we see that in, across the country. I mean, as a kid, I remember taking the Greyhound from Thunder Bay to Dryden to visit my grandparents. And, then from Winnipeg, he'd go out and take the Greyhound. And now that's disappeared totally for years. And there are now smaller bus companies that are taking in, better ways perhaps to do it. And now those companies are talking with each other and saying, okay, let's figure out how to work together. But there's parts of the country that aren't part of that network yet, and they're going to need help to make it happen. And without that, we leave so many, even the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, that report talks about the importance of having ways to get places. It's the hitchhiking on the Highway of Tears that led to so many people disappearing. So it's an issue that not only is tourism, but it's got so many other levels to work on.
Well, and you know what, James, and you bringing this up, it's funny in that sense that I just had that conversation about 15 or 20 minutes ago with speaking with an operator out on Vancouver Island. And so to your point about this being a national issue, which needs to be looked at and addressed, is something that, we're actually looking forward to. And Mr. Wilson, I asked for him. He said there's a proposal that's being put forward with several companies working together to come with ideas to propose to government. So I've asked him to send that to us, and so that we can have a look at that.
It's just getting, I think the one thing we've all learned in the pandemic is that all of the weakest parts of our economy have been shown to us now. Everything that's weak, we've now seen that there's a problem. Now we have to figure out, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? The whole pandemic. I remember when it started, I was like many Canadians. You watched this coming. We started reporting on COVID-19 in February when the death toll worldwide was 240. And you looked at, you thought to yourself, there's no way this is going to come in here and shut us all down. How can a virus impact the world like it has? And it's shown us the fragility of human life, and our being here on the planet, but it's also shown us that government has a bigger role sometimes to play than we might like.
Well, to your point, the tourism sector was hit first. You've heard that before. We were hit the hardest, and it's going to be the sector that's going to take the longest to recover. And and Eric, and you can jump in on this. When we go back, we were advocating as early as January for the government to take those steps to close the borders.
Yes,
because we recognize the threat that the virus posed, and once it starts to spread, it becomes of a greater detriment to us all. And we were accused of being racist for that, and we had no such thoughts other than the protection of of Canadians at home, right? And then right now, our failure here is on the failure of the federal government to then. They essentially, their jobs were the borders and the acquisition of vaccines. I sit on the industry committee, and when I was sitting on the industry committee, we had members of the vaccine task force appear. And so I was asking members of the task force, from there, the government entered into an agreement with CanSino Biologics in May. And within 3 days after that agreement was reached, they knew that that China was going to back out of the agreement. The situation with the two Michaels, the Huawei executive, they weren't going to follow through with the agreement that this government, announced publicly. Well, the task force didn't meet until June to review procurement opportunities and companies. They didn't order until August. And in fact, the public wasn't even made aware that the agreement with CanSino fell apart until July. So we lost about 3 to 4 months in that whole vaccine acquisition program, where other countries were out there. They were making their deals. They were making those investments with firms to ensure that they had adequate vaccine supplies. And we're seeing the results now.
Now, we're
And
also starting, go ahead,
no,
Eric.
sorry, and to that point, Tony, I was just going to say that, you mentioned obviously the tourism sector sort of hit first and hit hardest, and we know that as we're hopefully opening up and getting those second doses and getting things back on track here towards the fall, that all sectors and all regions need to be a part of that economic recovery, and that's why we've been focusing so much of our attention on tourism. But James, you also mentioned making sure that we aren't as unprepared for future crises and building up that capacity as well. And that's also a major part of our plan. We want to work with pharmaceutical companies to build domestic production of vaccines so that we can and PPE and rebuilding those strategic stockpiles that we should have been able to rely on this time around, but to many of the points that Tony mentioned, our government just wasn't prepared and wasn't in a position to respond as quickly as they should have.
Yeah, to Eric's point, that's one of the key pillars of our new 5-point recovery plan. And it's that notion of securing the country, and that notion we shouldn't be in this position or should not be ever again in a position that we were in for this.
Do you think after all is said and done, there needs to be like a royal commission to look at this, or should it be a parliamentary commission?
Well, I'd say, if I can jump in there, James, I'd say, we have to make sure that we have a thorough investigation of this, and we've been bringing forward that proposal to have Canada's entire pandemic response audited through Parliament, and I believe that's the avenue that we need to take and should take. And I do believe, James, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that the Liberals actually agreed to that proposal sometime back. So that's something that I do hope that all parties will agree to if they haven't already, because we need to understand some of the things that did go right and some of the things that did go wrong. Unfortunately, we know that many things went wrong, which is why we are still in this mess. But we definitely have to have that thorough review, and I believe at the parliamentary level is a great avenue to do that.
I think Canadians deserve it. And as we start to wrap up, Eric, as we usually do, a message for the riding at home.
Yeah, well, I'll say I'm happy to be back. I was just with Tony in Ottawa, but I took the red eye this morning to get back, and picking up on the topic, I was able to speak to the Budget Implementation Act this week, James, and specifically mentioned the fact that the tourism businesses had been hit hard, and that there really isn't at this point from the government, I think, a robust plan for an economic recovery that's going to support not just the tourism sector, but you look at forestry, mining, so many of the sectors in Northern Ontario that need that support. So I appreciate the opportunity once again to join the call, and thankful that Tony made some time to come on as well.
And Tony, thank you. And of course, Niagara Falls, deep down there in Southern Ontario, from us up here in what I call Western Ontario, and everybody else calls Northwestern. But I want to thank you for coming on as well and for sharing the information with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
To keep up to date, you have to subscribe. You have to hit that like button and hit the notification to stay in touch.